Rain had turned the road to the village into a ribbon of black mud, and Kayla's boots sank with every step as she walked past the first crooked fences. The silver brooch of Inquisition on her collar caught what little light broke through the clouds, and that alone was enough. Shutters slammed. A dog was yanked inside by its collar. A woman scooped up her child from the doorway and vanished without a word. Within moments, the muddy street stood empty, as if the village itself had exhaled and gone still. Only one man remained standing in the square. He wore a velvet coat the color of drying blood, its collar trimmed with fox fur, a garment that had no business existing in a place where half the roofs were patched with straw. He bowed low, too low, his voice sliding into an oily, practiced warmth. An honor, truly, an honor, he said, hands fluttering at his sides like he didn't know where to put them. The Inquisition rarely graces us with its presence. Kayla studied him the way she studied everything, for the crack that didn't belong. The coat, the polish on his boots, unscuffed despite the mud everywhere else. Rowan, a Warlock deserter. The magistrate ordered his arrest and execution. "Where is he?" Kayla asked in a cold, emotionless voice. The elder's smile faltered for half a second before he pointed a trembling finger toward the edge of the village, where a single crooked hut leaned against the tree line, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. "The healer's house," he said. "Down that path, past the well. You can't miss it." She left him standing there and started walking toward the hut, her hand already resting on the hilt at her hip. The door gave way easily under her boot, splintering at the hinge with a crack that should have brought a soldier running, or at least a man reaching for a blade. Kayla stepped through with her weapon raised, bracing for the violence her orders had promised her. A battle-mage deserter, dangerous, unpredictable, capable of leveling a room before she blinked. What she found instead stopped her mid-step. The room was small and dim, thick with the smell of crushed herbs and old sweat. A man knelt on the dirt floor beside a straw pallet, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands bare, no gloves, no rings, nothing that marked a sorcerer, pressed against the shaking shoulder of a feverish farmhand. The patient muttered nonsense, eyes glassy, skin slick and gray. The man didn't so much as glance at the broken door hanging off its hinge. He glanced at her, only briefly, taking in the brooch, the blade, the stance built for killing. Something in his face didn't shift the way fear should have shifted it. He looked tired, more than afraid, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. "You're blocking the light," he said, without heat, nodding toward the small window behind her. Then, softer, almost as an afterthought, "The cloth, in the basin by your foot. My hands are a little occupied just now." Kayla looked down. A shallow basin of water sat exactly where he'd said, a folded rag floating on its surface. She hesitated only a moment before crouching to retrieve it, close enough now to see the fine tremor in his fingers as he worked. She set the cloth in his open palm and stepped back, letting the silence stretch until it had done its work. Then she said it plainly, his name, his crime, the sentence that followed both. Desertion from the Circle's war effort carried only one verdict, and she had walked 3 days through mud to deliver it. Rowan didn't flinch. He finished wrapping the cloth around the farmhand's brow before rising slowly, joints cracking from hours spent kneeling, and held out his wrists to her without being asked. It was the gesture of a man who had expected this day for a long time. But his eyes moved past her to the room behind him. 3 more pallets she hadn't noticed at first, each holding a body wrapped in sweat-soaked blankets. "There's a fever moving through the marsh," he said. "It's killed 6 already. If I go with you now, it kills the rest by week's end." He let that sit, watching her face for the calculation he clearly hoped was already happening. Take me after. Not before. Kayla waited the only way she knew how. Not as mercy, but as arithmetic. A village left to rot behind her would travel back to the capital faster than any report she could file, and the Inquisition's banners promised protection, not graves. Bad optics, her mentor would have called it. She lowered her blade, though not her guard. You treat them, she said. I watch you do it. The moment the fever breaks, you're in chains. She glanced once around the crowded room. Consider me your shadow until then. Something that wasn't quite relief crossed his face. He only nodded and turned back to his patients. By the time night settled over the village, Kayla had claimed the driest corner of the cramped loft above the hut, laying out her bedroll without once unbuckling her sword belt. Below, she could hear Rowan moving between pallets, murmuring instructions to no one in particular. She was still listening to those sounds when a head appeared at the top of the ladder, uninvited. The boy couldn't have been older than 13, all elbows and unruly hair, and he climbed the last rungs with the fearless clatter of someone who had never once considered that an Inquisition hunter might gut him for the intrusion. He set a wooden bowl in front of her without asking, steam curling off a thin but fragrant broth. Eric, he said by way of introduction, dropping cross-legged onto the floorboards like he owned them. You're the one who's going to kill him, right? The bluntness caught her off guard more than any blade would have. She said nothing, only lifted the bowl, and that seemed answer enough for him. He kept talking anyway, filling the silence the way children do when silence makes them uneasy. About the Hollis family's goats, all of them dying of the wasting sickness last spring, until Rowan sat up 3 nights straight, boiling roots nobody else knew the names of, about how not one goat died after that, about how nobody in the village had ever seen him raise a hand in anger, not once, not even at the boys who threw stones at their fence. Kayla ate slowly, letting the words settle somewhere she didn't examine too closely. The file in her satchel called this man a butcher who had turned his back on the circle mid-slaughter. The boy in front of her described someone else entirely. For the first time since crossing into this village, she found herself wondering which version was the lie. Morning broke gray and damp, and by the time Kayla climbed down from the loft, Rowan had already turned the square into something resembling a triage line. Benches dragged from nearby houses, villagers queued with children coughing against their skirts, buckets of boiled water steaming in the cold air. She took up position near the well, arms crossed, watching him work with the same unblinking attention she gave any suspect. It was the elder who caught her eye first, off at the square's edge, not among the sick. He stood half hidden by the smithy's wall, watching the healer's hut rather than the healer, his velvet coat traded for something plainer, as if he'd dressed down on purpose today. A rider on a lathered horse cut through the muddy lane and drew up beside him. Words passed too quietly to carry. Then the elder pressed a sealed scroll into the rider's gloved hand, and the horse was gone again, before Kayla had finished crossing the distance in her mind. She told herself it was nothing unusual. Informants reported to the Inquisition from every backwater village in the realm, and a scroll was simply a scroll. And yet her eyes kept dragging back to the elder's hand as he turned away, to the heavy gold ring catching the pale morning light. A ring like that could feed this village for a season. She filed the thought away the way she filed everything that didn't add up, in the quiet place behind her ribs, where suspicion waited to be proven. Rowan's voice cut through her thoughts, calling for more clean water, and she pushed the elder from her mind. For now. The trouble started without warning. One moment, the young man on the third pallet was murmuring through his fever. The next, his back arched violently off the straw, limbs seizing in a rhythm that had nothing human left in it. Rowan was at his side in 2 strides, shouting for the others to hold him still, but his hands were full, one pressed to the man's jaw, the other reaching for a satchel of dried roots he couldn't get open fast enough. "You," he snapped, not even looking up. "The green jar. Second shelf. Grind the bark inside. Fine as you can, now." Kayla didn't stop to weigh the strangeness of taking orders from the man she'd been sent to execute. Years of training had built her body for exactly this: precise, immediate, unthinking obedience to whoever held command of a crisis. And it carried her across the room before her mind caught up. She crushed the bark against the mortar's stone edge with more force than necessary, dust rising in a bitter cloud, then knelt to help pin the convulsing man's shoulders while Rowan forced the paste between his teeth. The seizure broke as suddenly as it had come, the body slackening into exhausted stillness. Rowan sat back on his heels, breathing hard, sweat darkening his collar. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he hadn't since she'd kicked in his door. And something like surprise flickered across his face at finding her still there, hands stained green, kneeling in the dirt beside him instead of standing over him with a blade. Neither of them spoke of it. But when he reached for the next patient, she was already moving to help before he asked. Night fell heavy and wet over the marsh, and Rowan led the way with a shuttered lantern, explaining in clipped, tired sentences that the moss growing near the black water was the only thing strong enough to break the fever for good. Kayla followed close, her boots sinking in the soft ground, more comfortable in this darkness than she cared to admit. It was the plants that stopped her first. Broad-leafed things clustered near the water's edge, their surfaces dusted with a faint violet residue that caught the lantern light strangely. She crouched, running a finger along one leaf, and the color transferred to her skin like powder. She knew that shade. She'd seen it 100 times in the Inquisition's own alchemical stores, in vials sealed with circle wax. "This doesn't grow naturally," she started to say, but the sentence never finished. Movement exploded from the reeds beside her boot, a whip of scaled muscle, fangs bared, striking low and fast toward her ankle. She had no time to draw, no time to step back. Rowan moved instead, shoving her hard sideways with his whole body, so that she stumbled into the mud while he took the strike meant for her, the snake's fangs sinking into the meat of his forearm instead. He didn't cry out, only hissed through his teeth and crushed the creature's skull against a stone with the same hand that was already beginning to swell. Kayla scrambled upright, heart hammering, staring at the blood welling dark against his sleeve. "Idiot," she breathed, though it came out closer to something else entirely. "Move! We need to get you back." The walk back to the hut passed in tense silence, Rowan's jaw tight with pain he refused to voice. Kayla's shoulder braced under his good arm, more from urgency than tenderness, or so she told herself. By the time they reached the loft, Eric was long asleep, curled small beneath a threadbare blanket, and the hut had gone quiet except for the fire's low crackle. She sat him down near the hearth and set to work before he could argue, cutting away the ruined sleeve, washing the wound with water gone pink, binding it with a steadiness her hands hadn't shown all night. He watched her without speaking for a long moment, the firelight carving shadows across a face too tired to hide much of anything. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, not looking up from the bandage. "Push me out of the way." "You didn't have to grind bark for a man you're supposed to kill," he answered, and there was no accusation in it, only something quieter. "Debt and duty aren't so different, I've found. Both make people do strange things for strangers." She had no answer for that, so she said nothing, tying off the last knot with more care than the wound strictly required. Rising to fetch water for the kettle, she dragged the stool aside without thinking, and stopped. Beneath a section of floorboards not quite flush with the rest, a shadow of iron showed through the gap, a heavy lock glinting faintly where the wood had pulled apart. It was no farmer's toolbox. The metal bore the unmistakable etching of alchemical warding, the kind used to seal things that were never meant to be opened by accident. Kayla said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the gap a moment too long before she pushed the stool carefully back into place. The rain came without mercy, drumming against the hut's roof until the first dark stain bloomed across the ceiling boards. Within an hour, water was dripping steadily onto the pallets below, and Rowan swore under his breath, already hauling the nearest patient upright by the shoulders. "The chapel," he said. "Stone roof. Nothing else close enough." They worked in tandem without discussing it further, Kayla taking the heavier end of each makeshift stretcher, Rowan guiding the weaker patients by the arm, both of them soaked through before they'd crossed half the square. The chapel doors loomed ahead, and so did the elder, arms spread wide across the threshold like a man defending a treasury. "You cannot bring the sick in here," he shouted over the storm, voice cracking with something that sounded like rage, but sat wrong on his face. "This is holy ground. It isn't meant for—" "Move," Kayla said, and let the brooch on her collar do the rest of the talking. She stepped close enough that he had to look up at her, close enough to see what she'd suspected since the square that morning. His hands weren't shaking with anger. They trembled, the way hands trembled around men who already knew they'd done something unforgivable. He stumbled backward, and the door swung open. Inside, the stone held the rain out entirely, and Kayla laid the first stretcher down on dry ground before glancing back at the elder, who lingered in the doorway a moment too long, eyes darting toward the dark tree line beyond the square before he vanished into the storm. Once the last patient was settled and the chapel had gone quiet, but for the rain hammering the roof, Kayla allowed herself to sit, back against cold stone, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once. Eric dropped down beside her without asking, tucking his knees to his chest, and after a while he asked about the scar that ran pale along her jaw. The first time anyone in the village had dared ask her anything so direct. She surprised herself by answering. She told him about the streets she'd been taken from, about hunger that never quite left even after years of full meals, about the Inquisition finding her half frozen in an alley and giving her something no one else ever had. A purpose, a name that meant something, a reason to wake up each morning. She didn't dress it up as kindness. She called it what it was, survival, repurposed into loyalty. Eric listened with the unguarded seriousness only children manage, then tilted his head. Bad people took Rowan too, didn't they? Made him fight in their war. He said it simply, without weighing the words the way an adult might have. He was strong enough to walk away, though. You were strong enough too. You just haven't walked away yet. The sentence landed somewhere Kayla wasn't prepared for. She opened her mouth to correct him, to explain that her order and his captors weren't the same, couldn't be the same. But the words wouldn't come. For the first time, the man across the chapel sleeping against the wall didn't look like a target awaiting execution. He looked like someone who had once stood exactly where she was standing now. Morning arrived pale and washed clean by the storm, and Rowan led her without explanation toward the village's old well, abandoned years ago when the water had turned foul. He crouched at its mossy lip and gestured for her to look down at the stones lining the shaft. The same violet residue coated the rock in a thick, unmistakable film, thicker here than anywhere in the marsh, clustered exactly where an underground stream fed into the well, before branching off toward the fields the villagers still drank from. "This isn't a fever born of bad water and bad luck," Rowan said quietly, straightening. "I've seen contamination like this before. I've caused it before, on the Circle's orders, in villages that looked exactly like this one." He let that settle, watching her face carefully. Someone poisoned this water on purpose. Kayla crouched to study the residue herself, running through everything her training had taught her about symptoms, timelines, containment. And piece by piece, The pattern assembled itself into something she recognized, not from any battlefield, but from restricted texts she'd glimpsed only once, in a locked archive she'd never been meant to enter. The staggered fevers, the seizures, the exact, engineered cruelty of a sickness designed to spread slowly enough to terrify, never fast enough to simply kill everyone and end it. "These symptoms," she said, her voice flatter than she meant it to sound, "match compounds the Order keeps sealed. I've seen the classification markings." The words tasted like betrayal even as she said them. Something she had built her entire identity on had just cracked, quietly, at the edge of an abandoned well. Night had barely settled when Kayla, restless and unable to sleep after the well, took up an unofficial patrol along the village's edge. Old habit, old instinct, the kind that never fully switched off. That was how she saw him. A rider moving without lantern light, horse muffled at the hooves with wrapped cloth, cutting a careful path straight toward the elder's house. She followed on foot, silent, keeping to the shadows the way years of hunting mages had trained her to. The rider dismounted and slipped inside without knocking, and Kayla pressed herself beneath the shuttered window, close enough to hear coins change hands with a dull, metallic clink. "The Magister wants confirmation," the rider said, voice low but unhurried, a man used to delivering reports no one else was meant to hear. "Is the spread holding to Valerian's schedule?" "Exactly as planned," the elder answered, and Kayla felt something cold settle low in her stomach at how easily the words came from him, how practiced. Another week, perhaps less, and they'll be on their knees begging the Inquisition to save them. Grateful, obedient, just as the Magister promised. The rider gave a short laugh, satisfied, and moved to leave. Kayla flattened herself further into the dark, heart hammering against her ribs, the pieces of the last 3 days locking together into a shape she could no longer refuse to see. Valerian, her Magister, the man who had pulled her from the gutter and called it salvation. She waited until the rider's hoofbeats faded into the night before she allowed herself to move again. She didn't wait until morning. Kayla crossed the muddy square with her blade already drawn, kicked open the hut's door for the second time since arriving, and found Rowan awake by the dying fire, as though some part of him had known this moment was coming. "Talk," she said, the point of her sword leveled at his chest, her voice stripped of the calm she usually wore like armor. "Now, everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, then exhaled and knelt beside the loose floorboards without argument, prying them up to reveal the iron chest she'd glimpsed the corner of days before. The alchemical locks released under his fingers with practiced ease, and inside, nestled in blackened cloth, sat a crystal that pulsed faintly with a sickly violet light, the same color staining the water, the same color staining the marsh. "I stole it from the Order's inner laboratories before I ran," Rowan said, each word measured, deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed this confession 100 times and hoped never to need it. "This isn't a weapon of war. It's a weapon of control. They seed it into a region's water, let a plague crawl through for weeks, let people bury their children and beg any god who'll listen. And then the Inquisition arrives with a miracle cure and a story about mercy." His jaw tightened. Fear breeds obedience faster than any sermon. Valerian understood that better than anyone. The sword in Kayla's hand didn't lower, but for the first time it trembled. "You're lying," Kayla said, though the words came out thinner than she wanted, less certain than the blade still hovering at his throat. "This is exactly the kind of trick a Chernokniozhnik would use. Twist the truth, plant doubt, turn the hunter against her own house." She needed it to be a lie, needed it more than she'd needed anything in years. Rowan didn't step back from the blade. He didn't raise his hands, didn't reach for any hidden power. Didn't do a single thing a guilty man cornered would do. He simply looked at her, steady, tired, offering nothing but the truth he'd already given. "Then kill me," he said quietly. "But look at the water first. Look at the symptoms. You already know I'm not lying. You knew it at the well." A small, frantic shape hurtled between them before Kayla could answer. Eric, tears streaking his face, arms flung wide as he planted himself in front of Rowan, like a shield too small for the task. "Don't," he sobbed. "Please, don't. He's not bad. He's never been bad. Please!" Kayla's arm shook. She stared past the boy's shoulder into Rowan's eyes, searching for the flicker of deception her training had taught her to find in every liar she'd ever faced. It wasn't there. There was only exhaustion and grief and a terrible quiet honesty that no illusion could counterfeit so perfectly. The sword slipped from her fingers and struck the floorboards with a sound that seemed to echo through the whole hut. The chapel bell began ringing before dawn had fully broken, a frantic, uneven clang that dragged half the village from their beds. Kayla reached the square first, and what she saw there emptied the breath from her lungs. A column of riders in Inquisition black filed in through the eastern road, banners dark with the sigil of the cleansers, and at their head rode a tall, silver-haired figure whose face she had known since childhood. The man who had knelt beside her in an alley years ago and offered her a purpose. Magister Valerian sat his horse with the same calm authority he always carried, and behind him, his soldiers carried no medicine, no healer's satchels. They carried torches, already lit, flames snapping wet and hungry against the gray morning air. "Burn it," Valerian said, his voice carrying easily across the square, utterly untroubled, as though he were ordering the clearing of a field rather than the deaths of everyone in it. Every house, every will, every soul that's touched this village. No trace of the crystal reaches another ear. No witness walks away to tell it. His gaze swept the crowd once, indifferent. "And find me the deserter. I understand he's grown careless." Villagers who had spent the last week huddled in fear of fever now stood frozen in a new and far more immediate terror. And Kayla, standing at the square's edge with her sword sheathed and her hands empty, felt the last fragile pillar of her old life begin to collapse beneath her. Kayla forced her spine straight and walked out to meet him, every step a small act of will, her face arranged into the composed mask the Order had spent years teaching her to wear. Valerian's expression warmed at the sight of her, genuine fondness crossing his features, the look of a proud mentor greeting a favored student. "There you are," he said, dismounting with easy grace. "I trust the deserter is dealt with. You've taken your time. But I imagine the swamp made travel difficult." He glanced past her toward the hut with mild interest, already moving on before she could answer. "I need a few more days," Kayla said, keeping her voice level, each word costing her more than she let show. "The village is still sick. Once I've finished treating them and confirmed the site is clean, I'll bring the mage in myself." Something flickered behind Valerian's eyes. Not surprise, not anger, but a cold, patient disappointment. The look of a man recalculating a variable he'd assumed was fixed. His smile didn't waver, but it lost all its warmth in an instant. "Treating them," he repeated softly, almost gently, as though the words amused him. He turned toward his soldiers without another glance at her. "Burn the houses. Start with the chapel. I understand that's where the sick have been gathering." Torches arced through the gray morning air, and as the first roof caught flame, Kayla understood, with a clarity that felt like the ground giving way beneath her, that every word Rowan had told her was true. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, take a quick second to hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to share this exact tale with other travelers. Also, Let us know in the comments where you are listening to this story from. Now, let's continue. The soldiers didn't ask twice. Kayla's sword was pried from her belt before she'd finished her first word of protest. Her wrists bound, her body dragged toward the elder's house and down a narrow flight of stairs into a cellar that smelled of rot and old grain. The door slammed above her, bolted from outside, and darkness closed in complete. It wasn't long before footsteps descended again. The elder's, unhurried, almost gleeful. He crouched at the edge of the lantern light he carried, studying her the way a man studies something he no longer fears. "Lord," he said, savoring the word like wine. "Valerian promised me a title, once the land's been properly cleansed. A house in the capital. My children never dressed in rags again." He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "You should have burned the healer's hut the day you arrived, Hunter. Would have saved everyone the trouble." He left her alone with the dark after that, and it was in the dark that everything finally came apart. Every kill she'd made in Valerian's name, every village she'd walked away from believing she'd left it safer, all of it rearranged itself into something monstrous, something she could no longer excuse or file away behind her ribs. She had no sword, no brooch, no order, no family beyond the one that had trained her to be a weapon for exactly this. She sat in the cold, grain-dust silence, and for the first time since childhood, did not know who she was. The door came off its hinges without a sound, no splinter, no crack, only a faint shimmer of displaced air as Rowan stepped through. Magic he hadn't touched in years, humming faintly around his hands. 2 guards lay crumpled at the top of the stairs, breathing but unconscious. The work of a man who'd clearly once been far more dangerous than any healer had a right to be. He found her in the dark, knees drawn to her chest, and crouched in front of her with his hand extended. "Up," he said. "We're leaving. Now." She didn't move. Her voice, when it came, was hollow in a way he hadn't heard from her before. "Leave me. I'm exactly what they made me. A weapon that killed for a lie. I don't deserve to walk out of here." "That's not your decision to make right now," he said, no patience left for gentleness, and closed his hand around her wrist instead of waiting for her to take it. He hauled her upright with more force than the moment seemed to call for, forcing her legs to remember how to hold her weight. "You can hate yourself all you like once we're both still breathing. Right now, you fight. Or you die in a cellar for a man who never deserved your loyalty in the first place." Something in the roughness of it reached her, where softness hadn't. She stumbled forward, following him up the stairs and out into the smoke-choked night, her body moving before her mind had fully agreed to it. They left the village and headed across the swamps toward a watchtower in search of temporary shelter. The marsh swallowed them within minutes, black water sucking at their boots, distant howls of cleanser hounds threading through the trees behind them. Kayla moved like something hollowed out, each step slower than the last, until the ground beneath her simply wasn't there anymore, and she sank to her waist in freezing muck before she'd even registered the loss of footing. She stopped struggling almost immediately. The mud pulled at her, cold and total, and some quiet, exhausted part of her welcomed it. An ending simpler than everything waiting for her if she survived. Eric's scream reached her from a distance that felt much greater than it was. Rowan was already there, flat on his stomach at the mire's edge, arm plunged into the muck to find her, roots of an old cypress the only thing keeping him from being pulled in after her. "Don't you dare," he snarled, hauling with everything he had left, sweat and mud mixing on his face. "Don't you dare let them win this easily, Kayla. Fight." Her fingers finally closed around his, and between his strength and her own last effort, the swamp released her with a wet, reluctant groan. She collapsed against the bank, gasping, and Rowan gripped her shoulders hard enough to hurt, forcing her eyes to his. "Whatever you did under his banner," he said, voice cracking with something between fury and desperation. "It doesn't have to be who you are. Not unless you let it be. You get to choose now." The old watchtower rose out of the mist like a broken tooth, its roof long collapsed, but its lower chamber dry enough to shelter them. Rowan built a small fire from what driftwood he could find, and Eric curled close to its warmth almost instantly, exhaustion finally claiming him mid-sentence. Kayla sat apart at first, arms wrapped around herself, soaked through and shivering in a way that had stopped being only about the cold. The events of the last day pressed down on her all at once. The cellar, the swamp, Valerian's smile as he ordered the fires lit, and the composure she'd worn her entire adult life simply gave out. She pressed a hand to her mouth, but the sob broke through anyway, and then another, until she was crying in a way she couldn't remember ever allowing herself to. Rowan didn't say anything useless. He crossed the small room and sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and after a moment's hesitation, drew his arm around her without asking permission first. She didn't pull away. "I understand more of this than you'd think," he said quietly, watching the fire rather than her, giving her that small mercy. "I lost everything too once. My name, my place, everyone I thought I could trust. You don't rebuild it all at once. You just survive the first night, and then the next one." For the first time since the hut door had splintered under her boot, there was no hunter and no fugitive between them. Only two people who had lost the same thing, sitting together in the only warmth either of them had left. Dawn found Kayla awake before the others, staring into the dying fire with a clarity that had eluded her for days. If Valerian's crystal could spread a plague, the same principles that governed its corruption could be turned against it, inverted, purified, transformed into a cure vast enough to save the entire village in a single stroke. She'd need catalysts, though, the kind only found in a cleanser alchemist's kit, and she knew exactly whose tent would carry the finest supply in the region. She left before Rowan woke, moving through the marsh with the silent precision the Order had spent years drilling into her. Precision she now turned entirely against them. The cleanser camp sprawled at the swamp's edge, torchlight and tents arranged in the same rigid formation she'd slept beside 100 times as a trainee. She knew every gap in that formation, every guard rotation, every blind hour between watches. Valerian's tent stood at the center, larger than the rest, marked with his personal sigil. She slipped beneath the canvas wall in the dead hour before the second watch, moving past his sleeping form with a steadiness that surprised even her, and found the sealed case of catalysts exactly where her training told her it would be. Every officer kept them close, in case a wound needed treating on the march. She was gone again before the sentries changed, the case tucked against her ribs, her old Magister still sleeping soundly behind her, unaware that his own student had just armed herself against him. Back in the tower's ruined chamber, Rowan laid the crystal on a flat stone at the center of a circle he'd traced with ash and the stolen catalysts, his movements careful, methodical, the focus of a man performing something he understood, could easily kill them both if done wrong. "To invert it," he explained, kneeling across from her, "the crystal needs a living conduit, something to carry raw power through without breaking. I can supply the force. I can't survive channeling it alone." He met her eyes, and for once there was no command in his voice, only a request. "I need you to let it pass through you. All of it." She didn't hesitate, not because she wasn't afraid, but because refusing had stopped being an option somewhere back in the swamp. She knelt opposite him, palms pressed to his, and when the magic surged between them, it felt like nothing she'd ever prepared for. Not pain exactly, but an unbearable intimacy. his heartbeat suddenly indistinguishable from her own, his breath forcing her lungs into its rhythm, every guarded wall she'd built over 20 years dissolving under the weight of being that thoroughly known by another person. She gasped, gripping his hands harder, and he held on just as fiercely, murmuring something low and steady to keep her anchored, as the crystal between them began to pulse with a new, golden light. By the time it stilled, both of them were trembling, foreheads nearly touching, bound now by something neither of them could easily name. The distant baying of hounds reached the tower before the torchlight did, and Rowan was on his feet instantly, sweeping the glowing crystal from the stone and pressing it into Kayla's hands with a finality that made her chest tighten. "There's a passage beneath the tower," he said quickly, pulling Eric up by the shoulder, guiding them both toward a crumbling stairwell she hadn't noticed before. "It comes out past the tree line. Take him. Run." "Not without you," she said, and meant it more fiercely than she expected to. "Someone has to hold this doorway," he answered, already turning toward the narrow entrance, hands crackling faintly with the magic he'd spent years pretending he didn't have. "It's the only way through. I can make it a wall of fire long enough for you to disappear." He looked at her once more, something raw and unguarded passing between them that neither had time to put into words. "Go. Whatever happens to me, finish this." She wanted to argue, wanted to drag him with her the way he'd dragged her from the cellar. But Eric was already pulling at her sleeve, sobbing, and the hounds were close enough now to hear claws on stone. She pressed her hand briefly to Rowan's chest, no words left for it, then turned and followed the boy down into the dark passage. Behind her, the tower erupted in fire and shouting, the sounds of a battle she couldn't stay to watch, fading slowly as the tunnel carried them away. Kayla burst into the square just as Valyrian's soldiers dragged the first line of feverish villagers toward a waiting pyre, torches already lowered, his voice carrying cold instructions over the crowd's terrified murmur. She didn't slow, didn't call out a warning. She simply ran the last stretch and hurled the crystal down against the cobblestones with everything she had left. It shattered in a burst of golden light, and from the fractured shards, a wave of shimmering mist rolled outward across the square, swallowing torches, soldiers, and villagers alike in a warmth that felt nothing like the poison it replaced. Coughing bodies straightened, feverish eyes cleared. A child who had been carried limp in her mother's arms only moments before suddenly stirred and reached up to touch the glowing air above her face. "This sickness was never an accident," Kayla shouted, her voice carrying across the stunned square, aimed as much at the villagers as at the soldiers frozen mid-step. Magister Valyrian poisoned this village himself, so the Inquisition could arrive as saviors. Ask the elder what gold bought his silence. The crowd's fear cracked into something far more dangerous. Recognition, then fury. Villagers who had spent a week burying their neighbors turned as one toward the soldiers who'd come to finish what the poison had started, and toward the elder, who was already backing toward the chapel wall with nowhere left to run. Valyrian's composure cracked at last, his careful authority collapsing into something far more dangerous. Pure, personal fury. He drew the rune-etched blade from his hip, its edges glowing faintly, with the same corrupted light Kayla had spent days learning to recognize, and started toward the crowd with the unmistakable intent of removing every witness by hand if he had to. Kayla didn't let him reach them. She snatched a fallen soldier's sword from the mud and put herself between her Magister and the villagers he meant to silence. "Still playing the hero," Valyrian said, almost fond, circling her with the fluid confidence of a man who had trained her himself and knew every habit she carried. "You always did have a weakness for lost causes." "I learned that from you," she answered, and met his first strike with a force that sent sparks skittering across the cobblestones. The duel that followed tore through the burning square, Valerian's blows heavy and relentless, built to overpower rather than outthink, while Kayla fought the way he'd once trained her to, economical, patient, reading the gaps between his attacks rather than matching his strength. Flames from the nearest tent threw wild shadows across both their faces as steel rang against steel, each exchange faster and more brutal than the last. Two people who had once trusted each other completely, now trying to end one another in the mud. Valerian fainted low, and Kayla took the bait a half-second too late, her blade wrenched from her grip by a twist she hadn't been shown until it was already happening. She hit the ground hard, weaponless, and looked up to see him raising his hand, dark energy gathering at his palm, aimed squarely at her chest with no hesitation at all. She braced for the strike that never reached her. Rowan crashed into the square from the tunnel's mouth, bleeding heavily from a gash along his ribs, moving on nothing but sheer will. He threw himself between them without a word, and Valerian's spell struck him full in the chest, hurling him backward across the stones, where he lay motionless, blood spreading dark beneath him. Something in Kayla broke entirely differently than it had in the cellar. There was no grief yet, only a white, roaring fury that erased every trained hesitation left in her body. She was on her feet and inside Valerian's guard before he'd finished lowering his hand, striking not with strength, but with every weakness she'd watched him favor for years. The left knee he protected too carefully, the half-second lag in his recovery after a large spell. His defense folded like paper under the precision of someone who'd studied him her entire life. She drove him to the ground and didn't stop until her blade rested at his throat, her breath ragged, her eyes burning with something far past rage. Valerian lay still beneath her, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, staring up at his student with an expression that held no fear, only cold expectation. "Finish it," he said, almost gently, as though guiding her through one final lesson. "You're a hunter. This is what I made you for. Do it." Her arm didn't move at first. Every instinct honed over 2 decades screamed at her to obey, to complete the strike she'd been trained her whole life to deliver without hesitation. But she thought of the cellar, of Rowan's hand pulling her from the mud, of Eric's small, fierce body shielding a father who'd never once raised a hand against her. "I'm not your weapon anymore," she said, and lowered the blade. She rose slowly, leaving him disarmed and broken in the mud, magic stripped from him by the mist still curling through the square. Around them, villagers who had buried their own children over this man's ambitions closed in, their faces no longer afraid, only cold, with the particular fury of people who finally understood exactly who had wronged them. Kayla didn't stay to watch what judgment they chose to deliver. She turned away from her old Magister and ran toward the only person who mattered now, sprawled unmoving near the chapel steps. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she pressed 2 fingers to his throat, searching for a pulse that came weak and irregular beneath her fingertips. Blood soaked through his shirt faster than she could stop it, and for a moment, the whole square seemed to fall silent around her, narrowing down to nothing but the terrible fragility of his breathing. Her mind raced through everything he'd taught her in that cramped hut, the herbs, the pressure points, the careful, patient work of keeping a body from slipping away. She tore his shirt open and pressed both hands against the wound, calling on fragments of knowledge that felt suddenly, desperately insufficient. The crystal's remnants still glimmered faintly in the shattered stones nearby, and she scooped what little golden dust remained into her palm, pressing it directly against the wound, with no certainty it would do anything at all. "Don't," she whispered, voice cracking apart entirely now, tears falling onto his chest as she worked. "Don't you dare leave me here. Not after everything. I don't know how to do any of this without you." For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then his chest rose in a shallow, ragged breath, and his eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but alive, finding her face above him through the haze of pain. "Bossy," he murmured, barely audible. "Even now." And Kayla laughed through her tears, pressing her forehead to his. A month passed before the region finally settled into something resembling peace. News of Valerian's crimes had spread faster than any Inquisition banner ever could, and faced with uprisings in 3 neighboring villages, the Order quietly withdrew its remaining forces rather than risk the story spreading further. The village itself began to heal alongside its people, roofs mended, fields replanted, the chapel scrubbed clean of smoke stains. Kayla walked alone to the edge of the marsh one gray morning, a shovel over her shoulder and a folded bundle tucked beneath her arm. She dug without hesitation, the ground giving way easily after weeks of rain, until the hole was deep enough to satisfy her. She unfolded the silver-clasped cloak first, running her thumb once over the brooch that had made an entire village scatter in fear the day she'd arrived. Then came the seal of rank, the hunter's marks she'd earned through years of obedience to a cause that had never been what she believed it was. She looked at them a long moment, feeling neither triumph nor grief, only a quiet, settled certainty. She let them fall into the earth together and began covering the hole, packing the soil down firm with the flat of the shovel until no trace remained. When she finally straightened and turned back toward the village, she walked without the weight she'd carried on her shoulders for 20 years. The hut had been rebuilt sturdier than before, fresh timber replacing the cracked boards, though it still smelled the same. Herbs, smoke, and something warm underneath that Kayla had come to associate with safety rather than danger. She found Rowan seated near the window, still favoring his bandaged side, but steadier each day, sunlight catching the gray threading through his hair. She crossed the room and pressed a warm mug into his hands, the scent of chamomile and dried mint rising between them. "Drink it before it's cold," she said. "You're a worse patient than half the village put together." "I had a good teacher in stubbornness," he said, and when he took the cup from her, his fingers lingered over hers a moment longer than the exchange required, warm and deliberate. Neither of them pulled away. She sat across from him, and for the first time since a broken door had brought them together, there was no blade between them, no hidden ledger of suspicion, no fear waiting behind either of their eyes. Just 2 people who had survived the same fire and come out the other side of it, slowly learning what it meant to simply stay. "No more running," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "No more hiding either," he answered, and the words settled over the small room like something finally at rest. The door banged open with the particular violence only a 13-year-old could manage, and Eric burst in brandishing a wooden practice sword, carved with more enthusiasm than symmetry, the same one Kayla had spent 3 evenings whittling for him by the fire. "Show me the parry again," he demanded, already swinging it in a wide, hopeful arc that nearly toppled the water pitcher. "The one that beat Valerian. You promised." Kayla laughed, a full, easy sound that still felt unfamiliar in her own chest, and rose to meet him, catching his wrist gently to correct his grip. "Elbow in. You're not chopping firewood." She guided him through the motion slowly, Rowan watching from his chair with an expression of quiet, unguarded contentment neither adult felt the need to name aloud. The small room, crowded with drying herbs and mismatched furniture, held none of the tension it once had. No hunter, no fugitive, no secrets pressed beneath the floorboards. Only a boy delighted with his makeshift sword, a healer mending slowly by the window, and a woman who had once come here to end a life, and instead found the beginning of her own. Kayla ruffled Eric's hair as he lunged clumsily forward, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt entirely, unquestionably home. Evening settled softly over the marsh, the water beyond the porch turning gold, then rose, then a deep and peaceful violet that no longer carried any trace of poison, only the ordinary beauty of dusk. Rowan and Kayla sat together on the worn wooden steps, Eric's laughter drifting faintly from inside, where he was already half asleep over his supper. Rowan shifted, drawing her gently against his side, and Kayla let herself lean into him without hesitation, her head settling on his shoulder as the last light faded over the still water. Months ago, she would have flinched from this kind of closeness, would have counted it as weakness. Now it felt like the only thing that made sense. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked quietly, watching the marsh grow dark and calm before them. Everything it cost to get here? He considered the question the way he considered everything, unhurried, honest. "Not for a moment," he said, and turned her face gently toward his. The kiss that followed was slow and certain, carrying none of the urgency of survival, only the quiet promise of everything that came after it. Mornings without fear, evenings without watching the road, a future neither of them had dared imagine when a door first splintered open between them. Around them, the marsh settled into its familiar hush, and for the two of them, at last, the running was finally completely over. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to Orc's Tales. Please also write in the comments what you liked most about the story and what you didn't. Which parts were the most interesting to you, and which ones you found boring. I will take your feedback into account and strive to make future stories even better. I'll be waiting for you here when you're ready for the next story.